Good evening and welcome to the Marion Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Shannon Miller and I'm one of the two Ath Fellows. For the past few years, the world's eyes have watched Syria as President Bashar al-Assad and various opposition groups have engaged in an escalating, bloody, and destructive civil war. While any outside observer can say for certain that what is taking place in Syria is horrific, few know what should or can be done to bring about peace. Our speaker tonight, Ambassador Robert Ford, knows this conflict well as he served as the United States ambassador to Syria from 2011 to 2014, at which point he resigned his post just over a year ago because he disagreed with the administration's policy in Syria and could no longer represent that in good conscience. Additionally, in 2012, while serving as ambassador, Ford received the annual Profile and Courage Award from the John F. Kennedy Library in Boston for his work defending human rights in Syria. Since leaving his post as a U.S. ambassador, capping off a 30-year career in the Peace Corps and the State Department, Ambassador Ford now puts his wealth of experience to work as a resident scholar with the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. Ford's life of service to the United States, however, began long before his post as ambassador to Syria. He has worked with the U.S. Embassy in Iraq to help rebuild the government after the U.S. invasion in 2003, and he served as the ambassador to Algeria from 2006 to 2008. As they say, the rest is history, or rather it will be, in a few decades when the next generation of scholars and public servants can look back on today's foreign policy with the helpful lens of hindsight that would be extremely useful to ambassadors working in Syria today. Ambassador Ford is the 15th Pacesetters Fellow, a CMC program that is the culmination of the hard work and dedication of alumni from the college's first three graduating classes of 1948, 49, and 50. As always, audio and visual recording are strictly prohibited. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Ford to the Athenaeum.
Thank you, Shannon. Actually, I think I'm mic'd, so I'm okay. Shannon, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And let me first thank President Chadouche from Claremont, McKenna, Alida Wenger, and her staff, especially Dorothy Buchanan, who's put up with a lot of my requests on scheduling and timing. It's really a delight to be here at Claremont. It's my first visit here. It is only the third time in my life that I've been to Southern California, and I have to say that it's almost as foreign to me as the Middle East itself. I wasn't sure if I should wear a tie tonight, and this is a true story. I sent a panicked SMS message to Alida about half an hour before my dinner last night with President Chadouche saying, "What do I do? Do I wear a tie or not?" And she said, "No, Robert, you don't wear a tie." And I thought, the West Coast, not the East Coast. So they've asked me to speak tonight about what's going on in the Levant, in Syria, and in Iraq. And I am reminded of a story about Oscar Wilde and a friend of his in London who was a British archaeologist who spent a lifetime studying ruins in an obscure part of the world in the Far East, and was asked to give a 20-minute presentation at the British Museum about his works and his findings in archaeology, and he spluttered to Oscar Wilde, "How on earth can I possibly explain everything I know in 20 minutes? And Oscar Wilde told him, "Well, speak slowly." So let me walk through a little bit my thoughts about what's happening in the Levant and in Syria and in Iraq. I will speak a little slowly, but I then will look forward to taking questions. I start this with the cartoon, which I just found a couple of days ago, about what's happening. And I think this topic, what's happening in Syria, what's happening in Iraq, matters to everybody in this room. Because right now we have American pilots flying over Iraq and Syria and bombing targets. And I don't think I need to remind you how the Islamic State treated a captured Jordanian pilot. So we have young people putting their lives in serious risk daily now over Syria and Iraq. And I think we all need to understand, what are we doing and why are we doing it? And I think we also need to be asking ourselves the following question: does it make sense? So with that introduction, first, I'd like answers from the floor. What's the most important conflict right now in the Middle East? It's a multiple choice question. How many think it's the Arab-Israeli dispute? How many think it's the Sunni-Shia conflict? And how many think it's between Russia and the United States? So Arab-Israeli, Sunni-Shia, Russia, United States. What's the most important conflict? How many vote Arab-Israeli? Couple of hands, okay. When I joined the State Department and went to the Middle East for the first time with the United States government in 1985, unquestionably, it was the Arab-Israeli dispute. That's what Arabs talked about. That's what people in Washington talked about. How many think it's the Sunni-Shia? Yeah, good. That's absolutely what it is. The Arabs will tell you that is, no, I'm not kidding. Arabs will tell you that. Iranians will tell you that. And frankly, that's what Washington's focused on. Russia and the United States, Russia would like to be a player, but Putin so far has not been able to exert influence, and he lost friends in places like Libya with the Arab Spring. So can you see, yeah, I'm going to just point this. See this fault line? This is where Shia and Sunnis communities come together. In the words of the Harvard political scientist Samuel Huntington, who wrote the book Clash of Civilizations, this is the fault line. And if you follow the news daily out of Iraq and out of Syria, you will notice that most of the fighting is right along this line. And it's where the two communities come together. I think the most important thing to understand about it, and it affects us, is that the Arab Sunnis, let me stop. How many people know the difference between a Sunni and a Shia? And if you don't, would you like me to take 1 minute to explain it? Okay, in brief, this is a thumbnail. Shia believe that there should be one single judge or jurisprudent who makes final determinations about what is Islamically proper and legal, and his decisions are completely binding. And he should be from the family of the Prophet Muhammad. And believe me, this part of the world, they really can trace their genealogy back 1,400 years. This is a true story. I met a lot of Shia jurisprudents in Iraq, and they were very proud to pull out their genealogies, books this thick, and sort of go through it, and we'd go back to my grandfather in 1900 and my great-great-grandfather in the year 1800, and my great-great-great-great-grandfather in 1700, all the way back to the year 600. And then they would say to me, Robert, what about your family history? And I'd say, well, I think my grandfather was from Ireland, but I'm not really sure. Sunnis, by contrast, do not believe that there can be only one single jurisprudent, and they do not believe that it has to come from the family of the prophet. And so they look at this Shia insistence on a single jurisprudent, in this case, the ruler of Iran, the supreme leader, whose name is Khamenei. They look at that as an attempt of the Shia to impose control on them. Does that make sense? So they look at the Shia, Khamenei, the sole jurisprudent for the Shia, is the highest jurisprudent, trying to impose control on them. In addition, Iran is now very influential in Iraq, very influential in Syria, now gaining influence in Yemen, over here in Bahrain. So countries like Saudi Arabia and Turkey are feeling more and more surrounded by Iran and Shia allies of Iran. And they're, of course, fighting back. They're fighting back. That's why you have this line. That's why you have that conflict. But the most important thing is that the two communities are actually fighting for control and influence in countries like Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen. So when we think about the Islamic State, you have to understand that context. Where did this guy, Omar al-Baghdadi, the Caliph of the Islamic, where did he come from? Well, he got his start fighting the Americans, the American army in Iraq. And why was he fighting the American army in Iraq? Because the American army in Iraq overthrew Saddam Hussein, Sunni leader, and the Americans turned the government over to a Shia government, which he says they're trying to take over our country. In a sense, he's right. They are trying to take over his country. So he rejects that. He's part of this Sunni counterwave against the Shia. He actually doesn't look at the Americans as the biggest single enemy. He looks at the Iranians and the Shia as the biggest single enemy. But he's also looked at the United States and said, they clearly are a problem. They're clearly supporting the Iranians, and they're trying to impose on us as well. And so he's killed poor American journalists like Jim Foley and David Satalov. He's killed American aid workers like Peter Kessig. He's ruthless. He's without scruples. Of course, he can point to certain incidents in the start of Islam in the 7th century and say, they did this in the 7th century, therefore it's permitted for us to do this in the 21st century. But the main point that I'd like you to understand is that he represents part of, not the only part, but part of a Sunni Arab community that feels itself under attack and is fighting back. Let me go on then. So, into this mix, Sunni-Shia, President of the United States, Barack Obama, last summer said, things are so serious now with the Islamic State taking the city of Mosul, coming all the way down to the outskirts of Baghdad, that American military operations are necessary. So what I'd like you all to think about, it's not that I have a set answer or a recipe for surefire success, but I want you to think about what is the American goal in this, what is the strategy, and does it make sense? I want you to leave the room tonight asking those questions. So first, what is it we're trying to do? We have American planes bombing daily in Iraq. What are we trying to do? Are we trying to destroy the Islamic State? Are we trying to contain it? Are we trying to degrade it? I have heard different people from the same administration use all three words. I myself am a little confused. So if it's to contain it, you would have one strategy. If it's to destroy it, you might have a different strategy. For example, if it's to contain it, well, then maybe the Iraqi armed forces don't need to be so good, and we bring them up to a certain level, and then we can get out. But if it's to destroy it, maybe the Iraqi armed forces need to be a lot better, and that requires a bigger commitment from us in terms of training, supplies, equipment. What is it exactly? And if it's to destroy it, how do you destroy an idea among Sunnis that they're under attack? How do you destroy an idea that says we're defending ourselves against attack? How do you do that? Barack Obama last summer said we need Sunni and Shia to reconcile. that they have to be able to get along. And he said there's no way the Americans can do that for them. They are going to have to do that for themselves. But if you want reconciliation, how then do you destroy the Islamic State without dealing with that question of we're under attack and we're fighting back? How do you do that? So that becomes a question of strategy. And is bombing the strategy? Is that how we're going to do that? Does the bombing lead to reconciliation? Again, I ask you to think about that. I know there are some people in Washington who think we have to be involved in Iraq to contain and reduce Iranian influence in Iraq. We lost 4,000 of our best young people fighting the war in Iraq between 2003 and 2011. Are we now just supposed to see Iran become a satellite state of Iran? Is that what 4,000 of our best young people died for? I don't think anyone in the United States would make that argument. So is the purpose then of what we're doing in Iraq not the Islamic State, not Sunni grievances, but rather to contain Iran? Again, and how does the bombing fit in with that? So I don't have an immediate answer to this question, but I think all Americans need to be asking this, and our representatives in Congress need to be asking this. And then finally, I'm old enough to remember the Vietnam War. I didn't fight in Vietnam, but I certainly watched it on television every night during my high school years. The Islamic State controls this whole area of Syria. During the Vietnam War, whenever things got hard for the Vietnamese resistance against the Americans and against the South Vietnamese, they retreated into Cambodia and they retreated into Laos. We're bombing over here. We have a ground campaign over here. The Islamic State is already starting to move fighters back over here. Do you think they're going to stay in Syria, or will they come back into Iraq at some point? They came out of Syria into Iraq in 2014. So what are we doing about this? What are we doing about Syria? And can we win? Can we destroy, if that's the purpose, can we destroy the Islamic State in Syria if it's still existing in strength right next door in Syria? Can we destroy it in Iraq if it's existing in Syria? I've been along this border. It's nothing. It's just sand. There's no fence. There are no cameras. There's nothing. It's just desert. You don't even know when you cross from one side, from one country to the other. Maybe on some of the few paved roads, but there are very few paved roads out there. Mostly it's just open scrub desert. And of course, historically, for thousands of years, nomadic tribes, Arab nomadic tribes, used to go back and forth. This border didn't even really exist until 1923. So how, again, does the strategy fit with what the goal is? I mentioned the president in Iraq, president about Iraq said there needs to be reconciliation between Sunnis and Shia. Remember, the Sunnis think they're under attack. Right now, if you watch the news coming out of Iraq, NBC News, ABC News, if you're reading what the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, other American press are saying, you will certainly read about Shia militia in Iraq. Why? These are militias that are armed by Iran. They are heavily influenced by Iran, and they have a tendency, when they go into battle against the Islamic State, of course, remember, this is Sunni-Shia, so these guys are fighting the Sunnis, they're fighting the Islamic State. They have a tendency, historically and currently, to burn the homes of the Sunnis who were there. In some cases, they are guilty of mass executions. There was one incident, it's been well documented, where they lined up 70 Sunni men and killed them all, just machine gunned them. There are also incidents where they have kidnapped people and held them for ransom, Sunni Arabs. It got so bad that Human Rights Watch, which I think is a very well-respected organization, and they have a great research team, a lot of people who speak Arabic, go out to the field and do field site surveys, investigations. This is the cover of a report that Human Rights Watch just issued about a week ago, documenting the problems that the Shia militia are causing with respect to political reconciliation in Iraq. The president says there needs to be reconciliation. What's happening on the ground is that the Shia militia are making it much more difficult. Again, we're bombing. Shia militia are doing this. Does the strategy make sense? Let me then turn to another question about U.S. military intervention. Actually, I want to do one picture ahead. Oop, I'll stick to that one. Does anybody know who that is? If you do, raise your hand. Yeah, exactly. They're Kurds. So did you watch last autumn and into the early winter the bombing that the Americans were doing of a town along the Turkish-Syrian border called Kobani? Anybody see that? Yeah. These are the people that we were helping. These yellow flags belong to a Kurdish group called the PYD. The PYD has been portrayed as a liberation force fighting against the Islamic State. But actually, they also have an agenda. Not surprising, everybody in the Middle East has an agenda, and we have an agenda. The agenda of the PYD is to create an independent Kurdish state out of Syria, Iraq, and even parts of Turkey. You can imagine what the Turks think about that. They don't really want to give a part of their country to an independent Kurdistan. One of the things that's happened is these guys are actually very good fighters against the Islamic State. They're superb fighters against the Islamic State. They're motivated. They fight hard. Many of them have experience fighting because they were fighting who? The Turks. What about Turkey? Turkey is a NATO ally. Let me say that again. Turkey is a NATO ally. Turkey has a very long border, 800 kilometers, about 500 miles, with Syria, and then it has another couple hundred miles with Iraq. The Islamic State is just on the other side of the Turkish border in Syria. What are the Turks doing? The Turks are not squeezing the border. They're not shutting it down. There are still fighters from the Islamic State that go from Syria up into Turkey. They might get medical care. They might get supplies. They might just go up, rest, relax, and then go back down and fight again in Syria. Why don't the Turks shut that off? Certainly, let me tell you, President of the United States, Secretary of State, John Kerry, and others have urged the Turks to shut that down. Why don't the Turks shut down the Islamic State? It's because of these guys. The Turks say, and I was in Turkey at the end of January, and I had in two different meetings, two different senior Turkish officials said to me the same thing. We do not want to replace one terror group, the Islamic State, with another terror group, the Kurdish PYD. You Americans, by helping the PYD against the Islamic State, without telling them to negotiate their separatist ambitions, are encouraging them to set up an independent state. In fact, the PYD did unilaterally announce an autonomous region. They've already set up an administration to do that. And one part of Iraqi Kurdish territory has already said it wants to join it. So the Turks look at this and say the Americans are indirectly enabling these people's separatist agenda. I don't think anybody in the United States government is trying to create an independent Kurdistan right now. I don't think it's not what the Pentagon is trying to do. It's not what the State Department is trying to do. It's not what the White House is trying to do. They're trying to fight the Islamic State. These guys are good fighters against the Islamic State. But I go back to what I said about unintended consequences. The strategy, is it well thought out? And especially, are we talking to the other states in the region about what we're doing and listening to them and taking their goals and objectives into mind as we formulate our strategy? one of my favorite ambassadors with whom I worked as a young officer, said to me once, American foreign policy is unique because it's the only foreign policy that is made without reference to foreigners. This is precisely an example about what Ambassador Ron Newman was talking about. The Turks are furious at us about this, and we're furious at the Turks. And it's like this between two NATO allies. Not healthy. I'm going to talk just a few more minutes, and then I'm going to take questions. So I've talked about Iraq and the Shia militia and the difficulties that poses for political reconciliation and how difficult it will be to convince Sunnis to reconcile while Shia militia are burning and killing. Now, what about in Syria? In Syria, we're bombing, but we're only bombing the Islamic State. If you've noticed the policy, President and others in the administration have said, we will not in any way attack Bashar al-Assad. We're not coming after him. We're only going after the Islamic State. This is a sign from a protest in northern Syria. You can see the date, 16th of October. This is actually from a place in northern Aleppo province. It's called Kafra Nebel. See the sign here. Kafra Nebel, they have some guy there who does signs in English about once every week or two when they do their protest. So you can see what he says. They don't think that you can contain or degrade or destroy the Islamic State without dealing with the problem of Bashar al-Assad. And why is that? Does anybody know what this is? A Syrian military intelligence defector. Maybe I should explain about Syrian military intelligence. Syria is a great country. It has 4 secret police services. Russia only had 1, the KGB, or Soviet Union only had the KGB. The Syrians have 4. Why do they have 4? Because they each watch each other, and then they watch everybody else. That's how they prevent coups. But a secret police can't overthrow Bashar al-Assad because they got 3 other secret police agencies watching that one as well as each other and everybody else. A defector from Syrian military intelligence, one of the 4 secret police services, came out of Syria with about 10,000 pictures. It's been in the news. You can Google it. The defector's code name is Caesar. He has never released his name publicly because he still has family in Syria, and he does not want his family arrested and murdered. He, like the Nazis, the Assad regime is very methodical. When it kills people in detention, it actually records their bodies so that they have a final disposition. He brought out the pictures of over 5,000 victims who had been starved and tortured to death. This is one of the milder pictures. In fact, if you check the news, you will see that his pictures are on display right now in the United Nations building in New York. There's a wing of the main floor that they have turned over, and these are now being put on display at the United Nations. There was a display of these pictures at the United States Holocaust Museum in Washington at the beginning of the year for a couple of weeks. Madeleine Albright insisted that they have these pictures on display to show the world what is going on inside Syria. So this is what the Assad regime is doing to the political opposition in Syria. And these people say, if you don't deal with that brutality and that oppression, you can't control, you can't degrade, you can't destroy the Islamic State. Let me tell you a story. This guy is named Abdelbasit Seyrut. He was the goalie, and a very good goalie, for one of the main Syrian soccer teams. In 2011, when the peaceful protests against Bashar al-Assad started, he joined the peaceful protest marches. When the government cracked down hard and began shooting at the demonstrators in the second half of 2011, he joined the armed opposition. He eventually became a local commander during 2012 and was in charge of a city called Homs, which is the third largest city in Syria. Maybe some of you would remember there was an American journalist named Anne-Marie Colvin. She had a black eye patch. She was with him in Homs when it was under siege. The Syrian government forces tried to storm Homs, and they were pushed back. They never had enough forces to take it. So they surrounded it. They wouldn't allow food. They would not allow medicine. They would not allow water. They would not allow any kind of medical supplies, nor would they allow any medical personnel in, and they would allow no one to leave. They just surrounded it. They basically tried to starve the people out. Many people did starve. No exact numbers, but we estimate hundreds of people starved to death. The State Department certainly knew about it. We saw the videos that people like Abdelbasid Seydoud were uploading to the internet, and then you can still see them on YouTube if you Google them. So 2 years they went through this, and I do mean hundreds of people starved to death. The regime was bombing, the regime was shelling. On at least one occasion, we think they used poison gas. After 2 years of this, the United Nations finally was able to negotiate a ceasefire, and Abdelbasid, former goalie, came out with his men and what was left of their families. He immediately went to eastern Syria and joined the Islamic State. Immediately went to eastern Syria and joined the Islamic State. Syrian political activists that I know, the families know each other. His family knows, the guy I talked to knows Abdelbasid's family, and called him, and actually, the family, well, try this phone number, try this phone number. He finally got through to him in eastern Syria at the beginning of January of this year. And he said to him, why on earth would you join a group as brutal, as reprehensible, as disgusting as the Islamic State? What got into you? You used to play football, soccer. They kill people now for playing soccer. Why would you ever join them? And he said Abdelbasid threw it right back at him in his face. Was completely unapologetic and said, for 2 years in Homs, women starved, children starved, civilians died under Assad regime bombing, people were arrested and tortured and killed, and nobody lifted a finger. And you now want to lecture me on human rights and democracy? How dare you? My point is, there are a lot of Abdelbasids in Syria. Our bombing can kill 100 a day, and the Islamic State, if they don't recruit 100 a day, they'll recruit 70 a day. How long will this take to degrade and contain the Islamic State in Syria if you don't deal with the root of the problem, which is the brutality of the regime in the civil war? I'm going to close then with two thoughts. This is the first. I think Alida Wenger, who's here somewhere in the audience, there she is. Alida, you'll appreciate this. When I was the American ambassador in Algeria, a place that had a horrible civil war between Islamists and secularists in the mid-90s, over 200,000 Algerians died in this is pre-YouTube, pre-internet. So nobody really knew about it. We were there at the American Embassy tracking it. The civil war ended in about the year 2000, after 200,000 were dead. One of the epicenters of that vicious fighting between Islamists and secularists was in Western Algeria, and I went to Western Algeria in 2008 and went to the University of Tlemcen. Why did I go there? We had a small program of teaching English to Algerian students at the University of Tlemcen. Tlemcen in the mid-90s was such a hot spot, no foreigner went there. Let me say that again. It was such a hot spot. There were so many nasty, horrible terrorists, Islamic persuasion in Tlemcen, nobody could go there. It was almost like a ghost town. I went there in 2008, about 8 years after the fighting stopped. The day that I went there, the Israelis launched a heavy bombing on Gaza Strip. And the last thing I really wanted to do was go to an Algerian university with Al Jazeera and the other Arab networks full of pictures of dead Palestinians. I thought, I'm going to get, tomatoes thrown at me, shoes thrown at me, people be screaming, yelling at the Americans for enabling the Israelis. It was going to be a disaster. So I told my public affairs person, I want a very low-key, we just go in quietly, we go look at the English class, and then we tippy-toe back out. Very quiet. So we drove up, and there was a big reception line. And I turned to my poor public affairs officer, a second tour diplomat, and I hissed at her. Her name was Alyssa. I said, Alyssa, I wanted something low-key. And she was like, oh, I told him, but... And we got out of the car, and the president of the university is shaking my hand, all these people shaking my hand. Much more than I got here yesterday, now that I think about it. The president of the university said, oh, we're so glad you're here, Mr. Ambassador. We've had to move the student reception to the main hall because it's standing room only. And I turned to Alyssa, I wanted something low-key. And she's like, oh. And so I was dragged. I felt like I was, on the way to the guillotine, going to the main hall. And we went in, and I'm not making this up. It was full. It was a room probably double the size of this room, and it was packed with students. And they cheered when the American ambassador went in. And I was absolutely dumbfounded. In fact, I don't think I've ever heard of an American ambassador being applauded at any American university, at any Arab university in any country in the Arab world. Alida, have you? Yeah. So, and it's not because I'm, a great good-looking American, it's something else. So I was so shocked, I turned to the university president and I said, why are they applauding? And he said, but Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, Mr. Ambassador, it's because of your program. And I said, explain. He said, you're doing English, but you have your long-distance learning program with the University of Missouri at Rolla. He said, we have 30 students doing an engineering program with Rolla in English. And he said when they graduate, instead of being unemployed, they've all got on their resumes that they have an American engineering degree and they're fluent in English. And he said every single one of them is getting a job. And he said, and it's the same with the program you have with the nursing school from the University of North Carolina. Every single one of those graduates gets a job because they speak English and they have an American nursing education. And he said, so all these students are here because they want to get in these programs. He said, so I need more English teachers. And he said, and I need more programs like this. This in a city that was the hotbed of Islamic terrorism just 8 years before. So I turned to Alyssa and I said, good job, Alyssa, well done. So I leave you then with this thought, that sometimes it is useful to use military force. There may be occasions you need to ask a lot of questions about it. This program, I'm not making this up, this program costs less than $500,000. We have already spent in bombing in Syria and Iraq almost $2 billion. $2 billion. This cost $500,000. I got to meet Condi Rice a few weeks after I visited Tlemcen, and I told her this story, and I said, can we just have a fraction of what we're spending in Iraq right now? Just a sliver, $1 million out of the daily $900 million we're spending in the war in Iraq, 2008. Can I just have a sliver of that to start some programs like this in eastern Algeria? And she said, oh, Robert, it's a great idea, but we have no money. This is true. Now, one of the things about being an ambassador is you're sneaky. And so after that meeting, I went to some of her aides, and actually Karen Hughes, who was also a friend of the president, was an undersecretary for public affairs. And I told this story to her, and she said, Robert, we will get you money. And we actually did set up a program like this in eastern Algeria. So it's not always military. Sometimes it's soft power. When you think about how to contain, degrade, and destroy the Islamic State, think about the total policy tool package you have available and apply them. Thank you very much. It's been nice to talk to you, and I look forward to some questions, Shannon.
We will now have time for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for either Kala or myself to come to you with a microphone. And as always, preference will go to students.
Thank you for speaking tonight. Whether or not you have a specific suggestion, do you think it's possible for the United States specifically to intervene without inherently picking sides on the issue of whether or not there ought to be a single leader for the Nation of Islam?
I missed the last part of the question. It kind of trailed off. Is it possible to pick a single leader?
Oh, is it possible to intervene without inherently picking sides in the debate of Sunni versus Shiite?
It would be possible to just stand back and watch, which is sort of how we got the Islamic State problem to begin with, I would argue. So to me, we can't fix the Sunni-Shia problem. I mean, this is a conflict that goes back a long time. And we can't really tell Sunnis what it is to be a good Muslim. It would be like Saudi Arabia telling us what it is to be good Catholics or Protestants. I think instead, it's better to break the problem down into pieces, and some of the pieces we can work on, and some of them others have to work on, and we need to encourage those others to work on them. So, for example, if we're going to be using our Air Force in Iraq to help the Iraqi government fight the Islamic State, it seems perfectly reasonable to me to put as a condition that the Iraqi government moves steadily and visibly, number one, to investigate allegations such as Human Rights Watch brings that Shia militia are committing atrocities. Number two, when those investigations are done, any members of Shia militias found responsible will be brought to a judicial process and punished accordingly. Number three, that the Iraqi government will move steadily to disarm those militia and instead reinforce, with our help, the Iraqi national security forces instead of sectarian militias. I have to be honest, I have not seen any of that. In fact, I just saw an article from the Agence France-Presse that said that there have been no investigations of any of the allegations about the Shia militia that have been raised by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and other human rights NGOs. And that, to me, will undermine any chance we have of political reconciliation in Iraq. There has to be some level of accountability.
Thank you for the amazing speech, Ambassador Ford. My question's concerning about the possibility of a Kurdish statehood. Mm-hmm. So in light of the Kurdish Peshmerga's successful efforts in kicking out ISIS in Kobani, Syria, mm-hmm. and their historical efforts in positively contributing to America's foreign policy, do you believe that, or do you think that America has a moral responsibility to help the Kurds in their hope for a national statehood?
Yeah. I think Kurds, like other people in Iraq and Syria, have fundamental human rights that must be respected, no question. Kurds suffered terrible discrimination in Iraq during the time of Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein used gas against them in a place called Halabja. We just saw the anniversary of that attack. I think it was the 20th anniversary, just a few days ago, about 2 weeks ago. In Syria, Kurds were, frequently their land was expropriated. Many of them couldn't get passports, so they were not allowed to travel outside of Syria. They were oppressed. They have fundamental rights that absolutely must be respected, as the human rights of other citizens in Iraq and Syria. With respect to an independent state, I'm not against it as a matter of principle, but I will tell you this. I think if they declare it unilaterally, without getting the consent of countries like Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, I think there will be wars fought over the borders of that independent state. And so I would much prefer that the Kurdish political leadership announce that they want an independent state and announce that they are willing to negotiate with other countries, Syria, Iraq, whatever, to set that up, but that they begin a negotiation about it rather than declaring it unilaterally. One of the things that's happening in Syria, for example, is they've declared this autonomous zone. Now there are Arab tribes people who live in that area. They feel they weren't consulted, and they're actually fighting the Kurds there. Some of them are joining the Islamic State to fight the Kurds. So the autonomous zone declaration is actually making it harder for us, with our campaign, to degrade the Islamic State because it's getting more recruits. So I'd like the Kurds to be politically smart and not just focus on what they want. Maybe the independent state is going to come in several stages. That's not unheard of. I think whatever it is, it has to be negotiated. It's not really for the Americans. It's not for the Americans to say, tomorrow, next week, next year, there must be an independent Kurdistan. It's for the people who live in that region, because they're the ones that are going to have to live with the result. We're going to be over here on this side of the oceans, far from the battle.
Thank you so much for speaking. So my question's a little more of a retrospective question. You mentioned a little about how the Sunnis feel that they're under siege, especially considering the U.S.'s actions and putting into effect Shia government. And you were in Iraq in 2003 when we were kind of rebuilding the government alongside Paul Bremer. And my question is,
Paul Bremer.
Yes. And I guess kind of as a live textbook, my question is kind of about de-Baathification and what effect you think that had on kind of the Sunni feeling of attack, and also how that policy happened.
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that, but first a question to the broader audience. Does everybody know what the de-Baathification in Iraq was? I'm happy to explain it in a minute if that's useful. Very quickly, Saddam Hussein's Iraq had a political party, a ruling political party. It was called the Ba'ath Party. After the American troops in 2003 went to Baghdad, pulled the Saddam Hussein statue down, a couple of months after that, the American administrator in Iraq, Paul Bremer, acting on advice from Shia political figures and Kurdish political figures, outlawed the Ba'ath Party. And in so doing, also not only took away the jobs of all the senior Ba'ath people, but he also took away their salaries and their pensions. So he took away not just their jobs, but also their salaries and their pensions. How do you think the Baathists felt about that? And there were thousands of them. They were, of course, to put it mildly, unenthusiastic. So a very great many of them, joined the fight against the American army. And even today, the Islamic State, most of its sophisticated cadres, the people who are administering the Islamic State's tax system, the people who are administering the Islamic State's education and healthcare systems, the people who are administering the Islamic State's oil sector, most of them are Baathists from the Saddam Hussein period who were left literally penniless by the decision made in 2003 to de-Baathify. Now, this again, to me, is the law of unintended consequences. I don't think when Paul Bremer issued that instruction, I don't think he had in his head that this was going to be the result. I think he just thought the Ba'ath Party was an instrument of repression, so let's get rid of it. And he was certainly encouraged in that by, as I said, Shia and Kurdish politicians. But in the end, what ended up happening is those Baathists look at that decision as just yet another example of the Shia pounding on them and trying to take over the country. And so one of the things that's happening right now in Baghdad is they're re-examining whether or not that de-Baathification law should be changed, should be amended. That has not been approved yet. There are a lot of Shia who still are not willing to make that concession in the interests of national reconciliation. It's a live issue.
Thank you very much for your talk. My question is also looking back at the Iraq invasion by the United States. What steps are we taking now with the current involvement in the fight against ISIS to kind of avoid the same problems we had after the invasion of Iraq, where we took out the government in power gave it the power over to the oppressed people, and then which could be seen as some of the issues that we have today with the Sunni-Shia dispute and also political problems in the area?
Your question is, what are we doing to prevent a repeat of that scenario?
Yes.
Well, two things immediately come to my mind. Number one, the president has put a very strict limit on the number of U.S. soldiers, ground forces, that go into Iraq. I think we only have about 2,700 U.S. service members in Iraq on the ground right now. I'm not counting the pilots flying the air raid missions. I'm just talking about the people on the ground. And they're not doing combat missions. They're doing training missions, which is a very different thing. So they stay in bases. The Iraqi soldiers are brought to them, and they train them how to use weapons, how to do small unit combat, and then upgrade to medium-sized unit combat. But the Americans themselves don't go out of the bases on patrol. The Americans don't go out of the bases to get into firefights. They stay inside the bases. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the president verbally has made a big emphasis on reconciliation between Sunnis and Shia. This might remind you of some of the things that President George Bush said about 10 years ago, 9 years ago. The real question to me is, will the administration be willing to go eyeball to eyeball with the Iraqi Shia and those militias I talked about, the militias that Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International are warning about, are really willing to go eyeball to eyeball with the Iraqi government and say, if you can't control those militia, we're out of here, because you'll never reconcile, you'll fight each other for the next 20 years, and we want no part of it. And I think that question needs to be asked.
Thank you so much for your talk. I have a quick question. How much do you think America should cooperate with Iran in the fight against Islamic State?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is a huge issue right now being discussed in Washington. It's a very big issue. So there is no for sure answer. There is no for sure answer. So I'm going to ask a question back to you, and we can all ponder it. If the root cause of the Islamic State, if the root cause, where did it come from, came from this Sunni anger at Shia encroachment and a perception that they're under attack from the Shia and from Iran. If we help the Iranians, does that increase or decrease the Sunni resentment and the ability of the Islamic State to recruit people like Abd Basit and those people holding the sign? Which is it? Does it help or does it hurt? This is being debated right now in Washington. Of course, the nuclear discussions touch on this as well. It's hard to imagine we're going to cooperate much with Iran when the nuclear issue is still unresolved. But this is being debated back and forth. Are we going to aggravate the recruitment problem with the Islamic State and the number of people going in to fight for it? Or would it actually provide militarily tactical benefits that would help contain the Islamic State? It's an open question. I personally think, this is my personal opinion, but I could be wrong, I think that if the Americans join up with Iran against the Islamic State in a visible way, we will simply increase the recruitment into the Islamic State, and it will actually grow bigger.
Thank you very much for coming and speaking with us this evening, Ambassador. I had sort of two questions focused on how we sort of utilize the tools of the state. The first one, sort of following at the very end of your discussion, talking about different methods of soft power and sort of non-military exercises that we can use. My first question is sort of which of those do you find or think might be sort of most effective or most applicable in some of these scenarios? And then my second question is sort of for you, sort of in your position as ambassador, you noted you needed to be a little bit sneaky. And I'm wondering that how is it that you can that one utilizes a tool as an ambassador to influence the policy or sort of budgetary decisions of sort of the domestic government back home in order to best achieve your goals abroad?
Yeah. Let me answer the second question first, and then I'll go back to the first one. The great thing about being an ambassador is people always return your phone calls. The title itself and being the personal representative of the president to a country means that other U.S. government agencies have to pay attention to what the ambassador says. One of my mentors in the State Department, who was a 3-time ambassador himself, once told me, you can't always get money for what you want, but you can almost certainly block anything from happening in the country because you have a power to say no that will go all the way to the President of the United States before it's resolved. And not many people want to argue an issue in front of the President of the United States. So because you have entree to senior level people, you can usually put your case to people who can make a decision on a budget issue right then and there. When I was ambassador, I could talk to the director of the FBI about our wanting to increase security cooperation with Algeria as we saw the Al-Qaeda movement in Algeria starting to grow in 2008. When I was ambassador in Syria, I could talk to the Secretary of State and say, we want to do this and this in response to what Assad is doing on the ground. And she'd say, I mean, I have to say Hillary Clinton was incredibly supportive. And she'd say, you go right ahead, Robert, we have your back. So it's just, you know, you have the title of the Senate confirmation, it means something. So I'm sorry, remind me the first question? Yeah. Cooperation in the field of education is my favorite example, but there are lots of others. For example, if you're trying to help a country's judicial system and its overall judicial processes become more effective, there are lots of programs we have. In fact, President Chadouche here worked on one in Iraq to do training of judges or to do training of investigators. We even did programs in Algeria teaching Algerian police about basic human rights according not to some American standard, but according to what was in the United Nations Charter. So it wasn't us imposing American views, it was this is what's written in the United Nations Charter and international human rights law. We also showed, for example, Algerian judges how they could do arbitration panels, could set up arbitration panels. It was up to them to set them up, but they could do it or they could not. Arbitration panels so that not every commercial complaint had to go to a court where they bogged down and frankly were subject to outside influence would be a polite way of putting it. So there were lots of things in rule of law, education, a lot of things also even in people-to-people exchanges. We would bring groups of experts in any particular field. Could be engineering, could be arts, could be business, small business administration, for example. Bring them here and see how, we did this a lot. We actually would bring entrepreneurs from countries like Egypt and Algeria to California because your entrepreneurial climate here in California is so good. And we wanted business people and bankers, especially bankers, to see how banks here worked with small enterprises. Not so that they would copy the United States tomorrow or the next day, because they're not going to, but at least to get them asking some questions and thinking about how they might apply something they saw here or there in some fashion in their own countries. So that's a long answer to your short question. But what I would say is usually the unintended consequences of soft power are much more manageable than the unintended consequences of military power. It's not to say never use military power. Certainly there are times to use it, but with extreme caution.
Hi, thank you for the talk, Mr. Ford. My question is more of a need for a history lesson. Was there a point in the modern history of the Middle East when tensions between Shia and Sunnis were aggravated? I mean, obviously the philosophical divide has been there since the foundings of Islam, but was there a point in the modern, the last 100 years when that became an issue, a greater issue?
Well, I mean, the divide has been there for a long time. During the Ottoman Empire, when the Ottoman Turkey controlled Syria, controlled Iraq, the Ottomans strongly preferred having local Sunnis administer local affairs, not local Shia, because the Ottoman Turks were in competition with the Shia Persians. But I think in more recent history, and something that's noticeably aggravated the Sunni-Shia conflict was the Iranian Revolution, where a Shia religious order took control of the government so that it wasn't just a cultural issue, but it actually became a Shia religious government that actively promotes, it says, revolution in the neighboring states. It calls itself a revolutionary state. And so repressive, underline that word, repressive Arab leaders like Saddam Hussein reacted to that by A, being scared, and B, hitting out hard at Shia communities in their countries like Iraq. And so Iraqi Shia suffered a very great deal at the hands of Saddam Hussein because of the Iranian Revolution. And I think that aggravated the tensions so that 25 years later, when the Americans went into Baghdad, there was a lot of bad blood between the Saddam government and the Sunnis, tribes that backed him, and the Shia, who had suffered terribly. I saw mass graves of Shia in Najaf when I went there in 2003. I had never seen a mass grave before, and I have to tell you, it was pretty appalling. And it was just a human story. The Saddam government was not like the Assad government. They didn't catalog, each person they killed and photograph the body and things. They just took dead people and threw them into graves and covered them up. And so when I went there in August 2003, there were still family members picking through the human remains that had been unearthed, and they were trying to identify whether loved ones were in the graves, a brother, a father, an uncle. And usually the only way they could identify them was there would be some recognizable item of clothing, a shoe or a shirt or something like that. Otherwise, the bodies weren't even recognizable. So, but I think the Iranian Revolution was the first and foremost comes to my mind in the last 30 years. Yep.
Thank you so much for your talk. I have two questions. So the first is, for what reasons did you decide to step down from your position as ambassador? And then the second question, and maybe this is related, do you think, especially relating to back before what you were saying about soft responses, do you think that breaking international law and using chemical weapons is reason enough for military intervention? Thank you.
The reason I resigned was that I was no longer able, personally, was no longer able to go outside the closed door of meetings, out into the public domain in front of the Congress, Senate, House of Representatives, out in front of the media, out in front of angry local communities, Syrian-American communities. You have a very active one here in LA that frequently came to Washington to lobby on behalf of Syria. I could no longer go before those different audiences and justify the policy. To me, it wasn't succeeding. It was clearly not succeeding. Things were getting worse and worse and worse. And we were not making adjustments to the policy to try to turn things around. And I personally felt I could no longer defend the policy. I told Secretary Kerry and Deputy Secretary Burns, people were starting to challenge my own personal integrity. Literally, I had Senator McCain say to me, "I don't think you understand." And I had people like Senator Corker say to me, "You should be ashamed of yourself." And they don't know, or they didn't know it at the time, maybe they know now. I was actually arguing against the policies behind closed doors. But when the door opened, I couldn't go to McCain in the hearing and say, "Well, actually, Senator, I totally agree with you, but upstairs, I'm losing." Can't do that. You cannot do that. If you're going to take a paycheck from the United States government. You can argue about the policies behind closed doors, inside the State Department, inside the meetings at the White House, but when the decision is made, you are obliged to be defending the policy, to be loyal to the policy that is announced. And if you can't do that, then you shouldn't be in the job. And I had to leave. I mean, it's clear. So your second question was about chemical weapons? I think once the President of the United States said there's a red line, and he said that in the summer of 2012, we didn't ask him to say that because I know President Obama doesn't like using military force. So the State Department never, ever urged him to say red line about chemical. But once he said it himself. I remember one of my staff people came and said, look what the President just said. I was shocked. But once he said that, and then once he said, you know, we're going to take stern measures, when he didn't back it up with military force, even if in a very limited way, I think two things happened. Number one, people like Vladimir Putin took his measure. And we saw that in places like Crimea and Ukraine. Second, people in the Syrian opposition looked at Obama and said the Americans draw red lines, but they never back it up. And it helped the recruitment of extremist jihadi groups like the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda in Syria. So it was a double whammy. Better never to use the word red line. Never, just don't use that word.
You mentioned like a lot of human rights atrocities and such in your speech, and my question is more about like morality, kind of like how do you balance human rights with U.S. interests? How do you balance like what your morality is or what you see as moral with what the U.S. thinks is right and their kind of institutional interests instead of like versus human rights, because they're separate. And it's not the top of the U.S. agenda for human rights.
Yeah. That's a daily challenge in foreign policy. That's a daily challenge in foreign policy. And different countries the policy comes out with different answers in different countries. In Syria, we didn't have a tight political relationship. They weren't doing anything for us anywhere else in the world. And under those circumstances, frankly, Washington told me, you can go as hard on human rights as you want and we'll back you up. And I personally was outraged when Assad started shooting peaceful demonstrators. So, and they did back me up. By contrast, in some other countries in the Middle East, just to give you an example, Egypt, where there was a coup d'etat against a government that most international human rights NGOs say was elected reasonably democratically, the Muslim Brotherhood government in Egypt. The Egyptian army overthrew them in a coup, is pursuing a lot of the leaders on charges that I think many human rights organizations would call dubious at best. So, and yet Secretary Kerry was just in Egypt saying we need to improve relations with Egypt. So in a place like that, I think human rights is still on the agenda, but maybe it's not at the very top of the agenda. So there are other issues that are high on the agenda. I think in the case of Egypt, it's what to do about Libya and the expanding terrorism problem in Libya. Egypt has a long border with Libya. Egypt has a lot of relations with Libya. So I'm sure they were talking about Libya. Knowing Secretary Kerry as I do, I would be fairly confident that he would raise human rights issues, but I'm not saying that he pounded the table the way, for example, we did with Syria. Overall, I think the United States stands for peaceful political development, whatever that development is. And so peaceful often also means gradual. My experience is that in places in the Middle East that try to create democracy overnight, Algeria, 1991, Iraq, 2005, it usually goes rather badly wrong, and it's better to take it step by step by step. So I think it's important to defend basic human rights, the ones that are enumerated in the Human Rights Charter of the United Nations. I think those are inviolable, and those you need to raise whenever you can. But I think that's a long way short of dictating to a government how to handle this particular problem, political problem, or that political problem. Is that an answer to your question? Personally? Right. Well, in Syria, as I said, they told me I could go as hard as I wanted on human rights. And so I was outraged personally at the way Bashar al-Assad was treating the peaceful protest movement in Syria. So I was able, frankly, to push it as hard as I could. It's not that the Americans could control Syria. We absolutely couldn't. Syrians are going to control Syria, not us.
Thank you for speaking tonight. I was regarding conciliation. I mean, we saw like last year in Iraq a big step in that direction when Haider al-Abadi was elected. But I mean, in retrospect to Iran, we could see it more of a symbolic gesture than something that was very practical. So I mean, I guess I have sort of a two-pronged question. First, what measures can be taken in order to further reconciliation of the Iraqi government in Iraq? And second, how do you limit sort of the Iranian government's influence on the Iraqi government?
Limiting Iran's influence in Iraq would be hard because there's a long shared border. There are a lot of cultural ties shared between some of the communities in Iraq, especially the Shia communities and Iranian communities. So, of course, Iraq's going to have a relationship with Iran. It's a different question to say that Iraq is going to take all of its major political decisions on the basis of instructions coming out of Tehran. So, but first and foremost, it depends on whether or not Iraqis are willing to stand up to the Iranians. I will tell you my own experience, and I worked in Iraq 5 years total. Most of the Iraqi Shia consider themselves to be Arabs, not Persians. They are Shia, and they'll tell you they share that with the Iranians. But I remember a very senior Iraqi Shia political figure once when I said, you know, are you guys just going to end up doing only cooperation with the Iranians and not with other countries? He said, you know, I was in Iran for 8 years during the time of Saddam Hussein. He said, you know that Iranians tell jokes like you use Polish jokes about Arabs, like they think Arabs are stupid and crude. He said, do you really think I want to put my fate in the hands of a country that thinks Arabs are crude and backwards? He said, his point was they want to be independent of Iran, even if they have good relations with Iran. And I think that's the key thing that we have to play on. We can help them if they want to be somewhat independent of Iran, but if they're not willing to join together as Iraqis and make decisions on the basis of Iraqi interests instead of dictates from Iran, there's really nothing we can do to change that. So it first and foremost depends on decisions that Iraqis make. Reconciliation is a part of it. It's not the only part.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions. Please join me once more in thanking Ambassador Ford.